Hey, yo, everybody. So we can build, style, and lay out our pages, which is amazing. If you've made it this far, you should be damn proud. And if you actually understood what's going on, you should be even prouder. If you are interested in me going into advanced concepts in styling and HTML or styling more and stuff like that, please leave me a comment or send me a message or whatever you want. I'll make more tutorials about everything we've just done. Meanwhile, since we're on our incredible road to building a web application, we are going to actually need to add some functionality. And here comes the third party in our holy trinity of CSS and HTML, and the third one is JavaScript. But before we dive into it, let's just talk about what is functionality. So I guess it is defined by something like the quality of having a practical use, or in our case, an application that actually does something. But for that, we will need to write code. So currently in 2020, even though there are thousands of different logical or visual editors and programs for creating functionality out there, the most common, basic, useful, and only working or concrete way I know is still through programming. And until robots rule the planet, I think it just might stay like that. In order for our application to do stuff, we will need to program some stuff in it. The language in which browsers run logic is called JavaScript. You guessed it. It is an extremely strong, expressful, and functional programming language, but it has not always been the case. We're going to learn how to use it, and we're going to love it. But I'm not just going to teach you the basics JavaScript from scratch for two main reasons. The first one, if I start going over an entire programming language and how you program, you are going to hate me. I mean, real adolescents, mom and dad hate, never open another tutorial by me in your life hate. And the second reason is the internet is loaded with tons of free, awesome resources. There are free video tutorials, written tutorials, websites, blog posts, apps, games, and whatever that teaches JavaScript in all levels, shapes, and forms. I even suggest you pause the video and go look for some basics one and come back if you want. But what we are actually going to do instead is continue building. And as we go along, I will explain what we are doing. So hopefully your neat little brain can pick up some concepts from doing. So let's go back to our application and let me just get rid of some of this CSS stuff. I'm just going to leave maybe one box for us to use, going all of my CSS. And now we're going to come back to it later. At the end of my HTML, I'm going to add a tag called script. And script tag in HTML is used to tell the browsers to actually parse the JavaScript language when it reaches this tag. So instead of it, we can place actual code. And I'll show you what I mean. If I type something like alert, which is a JavaScript function to showing an alert model on the page, and I say, hey, now we go back to our page and we refresh, and you can see I get an hey, yo. If you don't understand what's function or what we did here, don't worry about it. We're going to continue and do some more useful stuff. And if you know the script tag and you've seen it online, some people place a type here saying text JavaScript. And if you've seen this, don't worry about it. In newer browsers, you don't need to put this anymore. Script is enough to run JavaScript. Let's try and do something more complicated. Let's place inside our box, or let me just remove our box, and place a button here. So we can actually have some real functionality. And I'm going to say, click me. Now I'm going to go back to my page and refresh. And when I click it, nothing happens since we hooked up no functionality to this. And this is where JavaScript really comes in handy. We're first going to declare a variable. A variable is some kind of data that you can hold in memory, some kind of entity that later in code you can have access to. So before we continue our example, let's just take a look at what variables can do. Basically, in any programming language, variables are just containers for storing values, like we just said. And in JavaScript, in order to use one, you just have to declare it. So in our case, the declaration for a variable starts with a keyword var, which is saved in the JavaScript language. And then I can give it a name. I can call it X. And then I can either use it like this, is good enough. Right now I have a variable X in memory. It has no value, but I can also place a value in it. And this is called initializing a variable. So in this case, I would use the equation sign in order to place something inside my variable. And in our case, I'm just going to place the number 4 in it. So right now, X equals 4. And I'm going to place another variable, call it Y, and I'm going to place 5 in it. And then I could do a third variable called Z, and I'm going to place X plus Y in it. So Z would hold the value of 9. And obviously, this is an oversimplification of everything. Variables could have references to very advanced objects. And then in some cases, I could access them by that variable. They can hold strings, which are just chain characters together. Hello, world. And well, you get the idea. So let's jump back to our example. And in this case, I'm just going to call it a button. And I'm going now to use the most important, interesting, and maybe complex stuff we're going to learn in JavaScript, which is accessing our HTML, our document. This is why the Java programming language is so strong, because it runs on the browsers and it gives you an API to actually use your HTML. And if you didn't understand anything I just said, I'm going to explain it in a minute. Just know that we have an entity called document. And on this document, I have some methods. If I press dot, I can see tons of functions that it has. In our case, we're just going to say get element by ID. And this is the same idea that we used by CSS to select components from our HTML. In this case, I'm just going to place the ID on button and call it my button. In here, get element by ID is a function which we invoke by opening and closing parentheses and sending it the ID that we want to select. In this case, my button. So at this point, the variable button holds whatever this function returns, which is selecting by ID the element my button. This variable will actually have a reference to this HTML element. Right now, I can use some entities or properties and my variable, which refers to my HTML. In our case, what I want to do is access a special property on it called onClick, and I can put inside this onClick a function. In programming, a function is a named section of a script that performs a procedure. In some languages, this is actually even called a procedure. You could think of it in terms of making a sandwich. For a task like slicing an ingredient, you would need to always use a procedure like locate your cutting board, grab a knife, hold the object properly, begin slicing, and then place the sliced product in a bowl. If you wanted to make a program that would make a sandwich, you would have to type out the whole list of items each time. So that would mean repeating all these steps for each ingredient, like the tomato, the cheese, the pickles, or other sandwich ingredients. But if you made a function instead, you could just type in slice object and send it as a parameter to do all these steps. So in our case, we could use a JavaScript keyword called function, call it slice ingredient, open and close parentheses, and then open and close curly brackets. Inside the parentheses, you're able to place all the parameters that your function receives. So in our case, we would just call it ingredient, because this is what we're sending to our function. And then we would have to do something like locate cutting board, which could be a function by itself. Grab a knife, hold. Now, obviously, this would not work since these functions are not real functions. We just made it up. But you can see where this comes in. Some functions, such as alert or the console log, are functions that the browser already supplies to us, so we can access some of its features. So let's try and do this. And we're going to use the function keyword in JavaScript, which is just telling the compiler that this is a function. In our case, it's an anonymous function since we didn't give it a name. And inside of it, we're going to type alert and we're going to say, hey, yo. I can click the button and bam, once I click it, I get the alert. I can also use another tool that we need to learn and need to access because it's one of the most basic and most important tools for beginning programmers, and we're going to use it all the time. This is a console. So I can type something like console log. I'm going to delete the alert. And now going back to our page, when I click, nothing happens. But if you jump here to the right console, you can see that it printed, hey, yo. And the console itself is not something that is part of your HTML page. It is actually something from the browser. It is a function that the browser exposes to us, which gives us access to its developer console, and we can print and use it to do many different things. I could even say that I would like to log an error. So now when I click it, I can see that I get an error called boo. just remember, this is still a programming language. I could console log stuff like 3 plus 5, and if I refresh now and I click, then I see it logs an 8 since it did this calculation. I could also use different variables as string, such calling first name equals Bob and last name equals Dragon Slayer. And at this point, I can concatenate the strings. First name, and I'm gonna use the addition sign to add to concatenate the strings. If I click the button, bam, everything works. And before we explain everything, let me show you how we can write to the document. So if here I place an ID, target, and I close this div, then I could use JavaScript to select my target div now, calling it target, and I'm going to use the same selector we used before. We're going to select it by the ID, and because it's called target, this is going to work. And now when I click, I want target.innerHTML to be equal first name plus last name. And you can see that now this div has the correct text in it. What happened here behind the scene was a lot. We just use the DOM to change stuff in our page. From here comes the true power of JavaScript. So the document object model, the DOM, is a programming interface for HTML and XML documents. It represents the page so that programs can change the document structures, style, and content. The DOM represents the document as nodes and objects. That way, JavaScript can connect to the page. Our HTML and the DOM actually represents the same document, so it can be manipulated. The DOM is an object-oriented representation of the web page, which can be modified with a scripting language such as JavaScript. The interaction with this object is called the DOM API. Now, you're probably asking, what the hell is an API? An API is a term which is very common in programming, and if you haven't heard of it, you're probably going to learn it a lot. It stands for an application programming interface. It is a computing interface which defines interactions between multiple software intermediaries. It defines the kinds of calls or requests that can be made, how to make them, the data that formats that should be used, the conventions to follow, etc. So basically, in building applications, an API simplifies programming by abstracting the underlying implementation and only exposing objects or actions that the developer needs. A graphical interface, for example, of an email client might provide a user with a button that performs all the steps for fetching and highlighting new emails. Or an API for files, input or output, might give the developer a function that copies a file from one location to another without requiring the developer to understand the file system operations occurring behind the scenes. But you could also look at the buttons on your oven as the oven's API, which it exposes to you to be able to set temperature or decide how or what mode to cook in. Now we're going to combine everything we've learned, and I'm going to prove to you that if you've watched this far, you're already a full-blown out web developer, front-end developer, and you can build your own applications. First of all, let me get rid of everything we've written in script, and I'm gonna get rid of our HTML. And what I want to build is simple to-do app, which is the very basic example of almost anything on the web. Let me just first build the HTML. I'm going to have a div of ID with a list. This will hold all our list items. And then on the bottom, I'm gonna have another div called form control. And this is very common in HTML when you have a few input items like buttons and inputs or uploading files. This is called a form. This form control will have two elements, an input, which is an HTML tag we haven't learned before, but you can see online the documentation for it. It's just going to take an input from the user. I'm going to give it an ID of maybe to do input so we know what it is, and it's going to be of type text. And it's a self-closing tag like we've already seen. I'm going to put a button right next to it. And in the button, I'm going to say add to do, and I'm going to give it the ID of maybe to do button or add to the button, so we know what this is. Now, let me just do a little bit of styling. We want the input and the button to be right next to each other, and we already know how to do this. We just have to select the form control. And we're going to say it's going to be display of type flex, and the flex direction is row. So the items are next to each other in a row. And I'm going to give the list itself an initial height, just so we see it's there. All right, so I like my basic layout already. And now we're gonna start coding. And we're just gonna do like we did the last time. Let me get a reference to my button so I can use it, right? Because it's the only functionality we right now have on the page, which is picking the to-do button. So let me just get this. It's gonna be the same ID. And now we want to add to this button something when we click it. So I'm gonna use the unclick method it has, and I'm gonna place a function on it. And in this function, we're gonna do some logic. So let's first of all take a minute to think, what actually do we want to happen? So when a user types in the input, I actually want to take this input and create a new div, a new HTML element from this input, place it inside my list div, and then clear the text. It's gonna be pretty simple, right? So first, let me get a reference to my text so we can get the text itself. And this is gonna be my to-do input. Now, next thing, let me get a reference to my list because we're gonna need this later to insert the div inside of it. Now we want to create a new element, new item to do, and I'm gonna call it also with the name of div so I understand it's an HTML element, but it is just for my understanding. And we're gonna use document.create element to create a new element of type div. Now, I want the new HTML element content to be the value of my input. This places the value which is in my input, which is this text variable, because remember we selected our input, and places it in the inner HTML of the new div we just created. We also want to clear the value of our text right now. So we're gonna set this to be an empty string, which will delete everything so we can do more to-dos. And then all that's left is taking my list, which we already selected before. And now we're gonna use a method called append, which takes the current HTML it has and appends the new div to it. So let me just give it the new div because this is a thing we want to append. Let me save this and refresh. Now let's type some buy milk, finish, homework. Bam, we can see our list working. Finish, building an amazing app. And that's it, bam, we're full blown out web developers, woohoo! So at this point you must be thinking, are you freaking kidding me? I can't get a job with this information. I barely know anything. And you're right, there is still a lot of topics we didn't cover. We need to learn a lot more about code organization, programming in general, and system design. We need to become experts on front-end frameworks, or choose one like React or Angular or Vue and stuff like that so we can build actual large-scale applications. We need to learn tricks of how to design, spec, animate, and build some product and user experience. We need to learn how to build a marketing site, how to upload our code, how to serve it to actual users. And we also have a lot to learn about server-side programming and databases. So if you're watching this so far and you're still interested in any of these topics and you want to still hear me talk, please like, share, and subscribe. So at least I know somebody's watching and I'm not just talking to myself all this time. And I can continue making more of these because basically I can talk for hours and hours and hours if nobody stops me. So thanks.